The gleaming glass doors of Thomson Digital Solutions reflected the early morning sun as employees streamed into the downtown office building. On the top floor, a man sat quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city come alive below. As CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, he had built this empire from scratch, turning his innovative ideas into a billion-dollar reality. Running his hand along the smooth armrest of his wheelchair, Mr. Thomson remembered the day 15 years ago that changed everything. The car crash had taken his ability to walk, but it had given him something else, an unwavering determination to prove that disabilities don't define capability. Now, at 45, he had more than proved that point, though some people still couldn't see past their own prejudices. That morning, something was bothering him. He scrolled through the anonymous employee feedback on his tablet, his frown deepening with each comment. Noticed some qualified candidates mysteriously getting rejected. One read. Another mentioned, the new HR manager seems to have preferences. The implications were clear, and they didn't sit well with him. He placed the tablet down and wheeled himself to the large mahogany desk that dominated the room. The company he'd built wasn't just about profits. It was about proving that talent comes in all forms. He had created an environment where innovation thrived because of diversity, not in spite of it. Or at least, that's what he had thought. Picking up his phone, he called his executive assistant. "Could you come in for a moment?" When she entered, he shared his concerns. "These reports about our hiring practices, something's not right. We need to find out what's really happening in those interviews." His assistant nodded thoughtfully. "What are you thinking?" A slight smile played across his face. Sometimes, the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand. He began outlining his plan. He would go undercover as a job applicant, using a different name, with deliberately vague credentials that would require an in-person interview. "But sir," his assistant protested, "your absence from the office." "Will be managed," he completed her thought. "I'll schedule it during the board members' retreat next week. Everyone expects me to be working remotely those days anyway." As they worked out the details, Mr. Thomson felt a mixture of anticipation and concern. Part of him hoped he was wrong about the situation, that the anonymous comments were mistaken. But his gut told him otherwise, and in business, he'd learned to trust his instincts. His assistant helped prepare the paperwork, a resume that showed plenty of experience, but deliberately left room for questions. They chose a name that wouldn't stand out, created an email address, and submitted the application through the standard channels. When the interview confirmation came through, Mr. Thomson felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same feeling he'd had before every major business challenge he'd faced. But this was different. This wasn't about business strategy or market competition. This was about human dignity and the core values he built his company upon. That evening, as the office emptied and the sun set over the city, he remained at his desk, thinking about what lay ahead. He'd faced discrimination before, the subtle glances, the unspoken doubts, the automatic assumptions about his capabilities. Each time, he'd proven them wrong through his actions and achievements. But now he had the opportunity to expose something bigger than personal prejudice. He could shine a light on the hidden barriers that still existed in corporate America. Looking at a framed photo on his desk, a picture of him cutting the ribbon at the company's opening 10 years ago, he remembered the promise he'd made to himself back then. This company would be different. It would be a place where everyone had a fair shot, where talent and dedication mattered more than appearance or ability to walk. Now it was time to put that promise to the test. The next few days would reveal whether his company truly lived up to its ideals, or if prejudice had crept in despite his best efforts. Either way, he was about to find out, and he was ready for whatever truth he might discover. The following Monday morning dawned crisp and clear. Mr. Thomson sat in his home office, adjusting his clothes for the 5th time. Gone was his usual tailored suit, replaced by a more modest business casual outfit. Neat, but not expensive, professional but not flashy. He'd chosen it carefully to appear as a typical job candidate, someone qualified but not overtly successful. His phone buzzed. "Everything's set at the office," his assistant texted. "The HR manager has no idea about the investigation. Your interview is scheduled for 10 a.m. She'd been invaluable in arranging this, making sure his temporary absence from CEO duties wouldn't raise any eyebrows. The board members were away at their retreat, and everyone else thought he was working from home on a special project. Looking in the mirror, he practiced introducing himself with his temporary name. It felt strange, preparing to enter his own company as someone else. But something about it felt right too. Like he was finally going to see his company through fresh eyes, the way thousands of hopeful job candidates did. He'd gone through the fake resume one last time the night before. It showed solid experience in tech development, enough to qualify for the senior developer position they had open, but not so impressive that it would raise suspicions. He deliberately left some gaps that would need explaining in person. The HR manager would have to really talk to him, really consider him as a candidate. As his driver pulled up outside, not his usual driver, but someone who didn't know him, Mr. Thompson felt his heart beating a little faster. He'd faced countless business challenges, made million-dollar decisions without breaking a sweat, but this felt different. This was personal. The drive to the office took a different route than usual, approaching from the public parking side rather than the executive entrance he typically used. As they turned the corner, he saw his building with new eyes. The grand glass entrance, the corporate logo gleaming in the morning sun. It all looked more intimidating from this angle, more imposing to someone coming here for the first time. "Good luck with your interview, sir," the driver said as he helped set up the wheelchair. Mr. Thompson thanked him, appreciating how the man didn't make a fuss about the assistance, treating it as the normal part of his job that it should be. Rolling toward the entrance, he noticed small details he'd never paid attention to before. The slight bump at the doorway that his wheelchair had to navigate, the way some people glanced at him and quickly looked away, the subtle shift in their walking paths to move around him. These weren't things you noticed when you came in through the executive elevator. At the reception desk, he gave his temporary name, presenting himself as just another job candidate. The receptionist was professional and kind, offering him a visitor's badge and directions to the HR department. He knew every inch of this building, of course, but he listened carefully, playing his role. While waiting in the lobby, he observed the morning rush of his own employees. Some rushed past with coffee cups, others gathered in small groups discussing their weekend. A few nodded politely in his direction, but none recognized him. Amazing how a change of clothes and context could make you invisible to people who saw you every day. He took out his tablet, pretending to review notes, but actually checking that the recording software was working. The board had approved this investigation, making it completely legal to record. Still, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just about catching someone being prejudiced. It was about understanding if the company he built truly lived up to its promises. The elevator dinged, and he watched as people filed in and out. A young woman asked if he needed help getting in, and he politely declined, explaining he'd wait for a less crowded car. These small interactions, he realized, were telling him so much about his company's culture at ground level. Finally, his tablet showed 9:55 a.m. Time to head up to the HR floor. As the elevator carried him upward, he thought about all the hopeful candidates who'd made this same journey, each with their own dreams and qualifications. How many had been judged not on their abilities, but on something they couldn't control? The doors opened to the HR department, and Mr. Thompson took a deep breath. It was showtime. Whatever happened in the next hour would either validate his pride in his company or expose problems he needed to fix. Either way, he was ready to face the truth. The HR manager's office buzzed with activity that morning. Mrs. Wells, who had joined the company just 3 months ago, sat at her desk reviewing resumes with a cup of coffee in hand. Her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair matched the carefully curated certificates on her wall, prestigious universities, professional certifications, and leadership awards. On the surface, her record seemed flawless. The hiring numbers under her leadership looked good, productivity was up, and employee turnover was down. But beneath those perfect statistics lay a pattern that few had noticed. Qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds somehow never made it past the first interview, their applications mysteriously marked as not a culture fit. She glanced at her schedule for the day. Another interview was coming up. Just another routine screening for a senior developer position. The resume had caught her attention, not for its impressive qualifications, but for what it didn't say. Something about it made her uneasy, like there were too many gaps, too many questions. Standing by the window of her corner office, she watched employees arriving for work. From her viewpoint on the 10th floor, they looked like tiny pieces on a chessboard, and she saw herself as the queen, controlling which pieces got to stay in the game. She had her own vision of what the company should look like, who should represent it, though she'd never say that out loud. Her assistant knocked on the door. "The 10 a.m. candidate is here, Mrs. Wells." "Thank you," she replied, straightening her designer jacket. "Give me 5 minutes to review his file one more time." It was a power move she often used, making candidates wait just long enough to remind them who was in charge. Looking through the application again, she frowned at the gaps in employment history. The qualifications were solid enough, but something felt off. In her mind, she had already started forming assumptions about what kind of person would have such an inconsistent work history. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Lunch at 12:30. She typed a quick reply, then checked her appearance in the small mirror she kept in her desk drawer. Image was everything in this position, she believed. She had worked hard to reach this level, and she was determined to maintain what she considered the right corporate atmosphere. Opening her laptop, she pulled up the company's diversity and inclusion policies. They were there for legal reasons, of course, but she had mastered the art of working around them. A raised eyebrow here, a subtle comment there, a carefully worded rejection letter. It was all about knowing how to play the game without leaving evidence. The clock showed 10:15 a.m. She'd let the candidate wait long enough. Picking up her tablet and the printed resume, she walked to the reception area, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her assistant had placed the candidate in the waiting area, where everyone walking by could see them. Another subtle power play she enjoyed. As she approached the waiting area, she noticed the candidate in the wheelchair. Something flickered across her face, surprise, displeasure, annoyance, before she quickly masked it with a professional smile. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't part of her vision for the company's image. Her mind was already racing, calculating how to handle this situation. She had turned away candidates before, always with perfectly reasonable-sounding explanations. But something about this one made her pause. Maybe it was the confident way he sat, or the intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her practiced smile. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of her position, of her authority. She had handled countless interviews before, and this would be no different. She would maintain her professional facade while steering things in the direction she wanted. After all, that's what she did best. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she had perfected, polite but distant, professional but uninviting. "I apologize for the wait. Shall we begin?" The words were correct, but the slight edge in her voice, the barely perceptible change in her posture, already told a story about her true thoughts. Little did she know, this interview would be different from any other she had conducted. This candidate wasn't just another applicant to be managed and dismissed. He was about to change everything about her carefully constructed world. The interview room felt colder than usual. Mr. Thompson wheeled himself in, following Mrs. Wells through the door she had barely held open. The space was modern and pristine, with a large table and several chairs, all of which she quickly pushed aside with a slight sigh that suggested this was an inconvenience. "You'll have to excuse the arrangement," she said, her tone carrying a hint of irritation. We don't usually need to accommodate special situations. The way she emphasized those last words made them sound like a problem rather than a simple fact. Mr. Thompson watched her carefully, noting every micro-expression that crossed her face. He'd sat in countless meetings in this very room, but never from this side of the table. The power dynamic was completely different now, and he could feel the subtle pressure she was trying to exert. So, she began, shuffling papers unnecessarily. I see there are quite a few gaps in your employment history. Would you care to explain those? Her tone suggested she'd already made assumptions about the answer. Actually, Mr. Thompson replied calmly, I've been continuously employed in tech development for the past decade. I've just worked on various independent projects. He noticed how she barely looked at him while he spoke, her eyes fixed on the resume in front of her. Independent projects, she echoed, her doubt clear in her voice. That's rather unconventional. Our company values stability and reliability. We need people who can handle the demands of a corporate environment. The emphasis she placed on demands carried a clear implication. The interview continued with a series of questions, each loaded with subtle bias. When discussing team collaboration, she asked if he thought he could keep up with other developers. When talking about client meetings, she wondered aloud if clients might feel comfortable with him representing the company. Mr. Thompson answered each question professionally, demonstrating his deep knowledge of the industry and the company's technologies. He could see her growing increasingly uncomfortable with his competence, as it conflicted with her preconceptions. Our office is very fast-paced, she said, gesturing around the room. People need to move quickly between meetings, handle multiple projects, be ready to jump in at a moment's notice. Each phrase seemed carefully chosen to emphasize physical mobility. I'm quite familiar with managing multiple priorities, he responded, maintaining his composure. In fact, I've led several successful project teams in similar environments. She leaned back in her chair, a slight frown crossing her face. Led teams? I don't see any leadership experience listed here. Her tone suggested she found the very idea absurd. It's not always about official titles, he explained. Sometimes leadership emerges naturally through expertise and ability to guide others. A notification popped up on her phone, and she quickly checked it, showing no concern about this breach of interview etiquette. Well, she said, looking relieved at the interruption, I should mention that we're looking for someone who can really hit the ground running. The phrase hung in the air, its insensitivity obvious. Mr. Thompson noticed her slight wince as she realized what she'd said, but she made no attempt to apologize or rephrase. I believe my track record shows I can start contributing from day one, he replied steadily. Would you like to discuss some specific examples of my past projects? Oh, I'm not sure we need to go into all that, she said dismissively. You see, we have a certain image to maintain. Our clients expect, well, let's just say we need someone who fits seamlessly into our corporate culture. The tablet in his lap continued recording every word, every inflection. He thought about all the other candidates who might have sat in this room, facing these same subtle dismissals and coded language. And what exactly defines your corporate culture? He asked, keeping his voice neutral but interested. She shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. Well, we're a very traditional company in many ways. We value conventional professionalism. I'm sure you understand. The minutes ticked by, and with each passing moment, she seemed more eager to end the interview. Her questions became shorter, more perfunctory, and her body language showed increasing disengagement. Little did she know, every dismissive gesture, every loaded question, every subtle implication was being carefully documented. This interview was about to become much more significant than she could possibly imagine. The tension in the interview room had reached a breaking point. Mrs. Wells tapped her pen against the desk, her patience visibly wearing thin. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting her increasingly frustrated expression. "Let's be honest here," she said, setting down her pen with a sharp click. "This position requires someone who can handle intense pressure. Someone who can practically live at their desk during crunch times. I'm just not sure someone in your situation would be able to manage that kind of commitment." Mr. Thompson leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair. "Could you explain what you mean by my situation?" His voice remained calm, but there was a subtle challenge in his question. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, she gestured vaguely in his direction. "The physical demands of the job. The long hours. The need to be constantly mobile and ready for anything. We can't make special arrangements for every employee." "I see," he replied. "And what makes you assume I couldn't handle these demands?" Her professional mask slipped slightly. "Look, I'm trying to be kind here. This is a prestigious company. Our clients expect a certain presentation. We need people who can represent us properly. People who look—" She caught herself, but the damage was done. "People who look like what?" Mr. Thompson pressed, his eyes steady on her face. She straightened her designer jacket, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "I think you're taking this the wrong way. I'm simply trying to be realistic about the position's requirements. Our CEO has very high standards for the company's image." "Really?" he said. "And you're familiar with the CEO's views on this matter?" "Of course," she replied with a dismissive wave. "Mr. Thompson would never want anything to compromise our professional atmosphere. We have a reputation to maintain. Surely you can understand that some differences might make clients uncomfortable." The room fell silent for a moment. Mr. Thompson watched as she shuffled papers on her desk, clearly ready to end the interview. Her confidence in speaking for him, in misrepresenting everything he built his company to stand for, was remarkable. "You mentioned special arrangements," he said. "What exactly would be so difficult about accommodating a qualified candidate who happens to use a wheelchair?" Her smile turned condescending. "Oh, it's not just about the wheelchair. It's about fitting in with our team dynamic. Our culture. We need people who can keep up, who won't need constant assistance." She practically whispered the last word, as if it were shameful. "And you believe someone with a disability can't be independent or productive?" "I didn't say that," she backpedaled quickly. "But let's be realistic. This is a competitive industry. We need the best of the best. People who can run with projects, jump into action, stand up to challenges." Each phrase she chose seemed deliberately picked to emphasize physical abilities. Mr. Thompson noticed how she kept glancing at the door, clearly hoping to wrap up this increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "I have to say," he responded, "I'm surprised by your interpretation of the company's values, especially given our public commitment to diversity and inclusion." "Oh, those are just guidelines," she said with a slight eye roll. "Every company has them these days. But in the real world, we have to make practical decisions. I'm sure you understand." The tablet in his lap continued recording every word. He thought about all the qualified candidates she might have dismissed, all the talent the company had lost because of her prejudices. "One last question," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "How would you explain these views to the CEO?" "Mr. Thompson has never questioned my hiring decisions," she replied confidently. "He trusts me to maintain the company's professional standards. Besides, he's much too busy to concern himself with routine hiring matters." The irony of her statement hung in the air. Little did she know, the next few minutes would completely shatter her comfortable world of discrimination disguised as professional standards. As the interview continued, Mr. Thompson decided to probe deeper into the HR manager's prejudices, watching as she became increasingly comfortable revealing her true beliefs. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the interview room, adding to the growing tension. "You mentioned earlier about maintaining professional standards," he said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "Could you tell me more about your vision for the company's future?" Mrs. Wells brightened, clearly thinking she'd found a sympathetic ear. Well, since you ask. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. I believe a company's image is everything. When clients walk through those doors, they need to see success, strength, and, well, let's say traditional corporate values. And how do you define traditional corporate values? He asked, keeping his expression neutral while his tablet continued recording. You know, she gestured vaguely, people who look like they belong in a Fortune 500 company. People who can climb the corporate ladder. She paused, realizing her poor choice of words, but pressed on. People who present a certain image of success. Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you believe someone with a disability can't represent success? Oh, it's not just about the disability, she said, warming to her topic. It's about the whole package. Our CEO has built an impressive company, and we need to maintain certain standards. Mr. Thompson would never want anything to compromise that image. You seem very confident about what Mr. Thompson wants, he observed quietly. Of course. I've never met him personally. He's always so busy up in his office. But I know what kind of company he's built. Premium clients, top-tier talent, a certain level of presentation. She smiled, satisfied with her assessment. Interesting, he said. And in your 3 months here, how many qualified candidates have you turned away based on these standards? She stiffened slightly. I make decisions based on what's best for the company. Sometimes that means making tough choices about who fits our culture. And who defines that culture? He pressed. Well, I do, in many ways, she replied proudly. That's why they hired me. To maintain professional standards and ensure we hire the right kind of people. The right kind of people, he repeated slowly. And what happens when qualified candidates don't match your personal vision of the right kind of people? She shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm trying to be delicate here, but sometimes you have to face reality. Clients have expectations. They want to see strength, capability, normalcy. Normalcy? He interrupted. Could you explain what you mean by that? Well, she hesitated, then seemed to decide to be bold. Let me be frank. When clients visit our office, they shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. They shouldn't have to worry about accommodating special needs or dealing with different situations. Our CEO has built a prestigious company, and I'm here to protect that image. Mr. Thompson leaned back slightly, studying her face. And you believe the CEO would approve of rejecting qualified candidates based on physical differences? Mr. Thompson is a businessman, she said confidently. He understands that image is everything in the corporate world. I'm sure he appreciates having someone like me to handle these sensitive matters. Someone like you? He asked quietly. Yes, someone who understands the importance of maintaining certain standards. Someone who knows how to keep things professional. She smiled, clearly pleased with herself. The room fell silent for a moment. Through the window, they could hear the distant sounds of office life. Phones ringing, people talking, the normal buzz of a successful company. A company built on values very different from what this HR manager imagined. One more question, Mr. Thompson said, reaching for something in his jacket pocket. What would you say if I told you that you've spent the last hour explaining your discriminatory hiring practices to the very CEO you claim to understand so well? The color began draining from her face as he pulled out his company ID badge. The revelation that would shatter her carefully constructed world of prejudice was about to unfold. Time seemed to freeze in the interview room. Mrs. Wells stared at the ID badge in Mr. Thompson's hand, her mouth slightly open, no words coming out. The confident HR manager, who had been so sure of herself just moments ago, now looked like she'd seen a ghost. That's impossible, she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson is... She gestured vaguely upward, toward the executive floor. Right here, he finished for her, his voice calm but firm. sitting in front of you in this wheelchair that you seem to think makes someone unqualified to work in their own company. She reached for her water glass with a shaking hand, nearly knocking it over. But I don't understand. Why would you? Why would I pose as a job applicant? He asked, putting his ID badge on the table between them. Because I received some concerning reports about our hiring practices. Reports that suggested qualified candidates were being turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities. The color continued draining from her face as the full impact of the situation hit her. Every dismissive comment, every prejudiced assumption, every discriminatory remark she'd made during the interview played back in her mind. I was just trying to maintain professional standards, she said weakly, clinging to her previous justifications. Professional standards, he repeated, his voice taking on an edge. Let me tell you about professional standards. He reached for his tablet, turning it to face her. I've recorded this entire interview. Would you like to hear yourself explain how someone in a wheelchair couldn't possibly represent this company properly? She sank back in her chair, her perfectly maintained professional facade crumbling. Mr. Thompson, I can explain. You've done plenty of explaining, he interrupted. You've explained very clearly how you've been discriminating against qualified candidates based on your personal prejudices. You've explained how you took it upon yourself to decide what image this company should project. An image that apparently doesn't include people with disabilities. Through the office windows, they could see employees going about their day, unaware of the drama unfolding in the interview room. Mr. Thompson thought about all the talented individuals who might have been turned away because of this woman's biases. Do you know how I built this company? He asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. I built it after my accident, when people like you told me I couldn't do it, when they saw the wheelchair and decided that was all they needed to know about me. I built it specifically to be a place where people would be judged on their abilities, not their disabilities. Mrs. Wells opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her carefully constructed world of discrimination disguised as professional standards was collapsing around her. But sir, she finally managed, I was only trying to protect the company's image. The company's image? He said sharply. Let me tell you about our image. Our image is built on innovation, on giving opportunities to talented people regardless of their physical abilities. Our image is about breaking down barriers, not building them up. And you've been sitting here, in my company, systematically destroying everything we stand for. He picked up his tablet, pressing a few buttons. I'm sending this recording to our legal department right now. They'll be particularly interested in the part where you dismissed our diversity policies as just guidelines. The reality of her situation finally seemed to hit her. Her perfect job, her authority over hiring decisions, her future in corporate HR. It was all crumbling because of her own prejudiced words. Mr. Thompson, please, she began, but he held up his hand. For 3 months, he said quietly, you've been the gatekeeper of this company, turning away qualified people because they didn't fit your narrow view of what professionals should look like. How many talented developers, analysts, and managers did we lose because of your prejudices? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows in the room seemed darker, matching the gravity of the moment. Everything was about to change, and Mrs. Wells knew it. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Security cameras captured Mrs. Wells being escorted from the building, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Her face, usually so confident and composed, now showed the shock of someone whose world had just turned upside down. Mr. Thompson sat in the now empty interview room, reviewing the recording on his tablet. His assistant had joined him, bringing the files they'd need for what would come next. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from today's interview, but from the pattern of rejections over the past 3 months. Pull up the applications she rejected, he said quietly. The list that appeared on screen made his heart sink. Dozens of qualified candidates, many with impressive credentials, all dismissed for vague reasons like not a cultural fit or insufficient corporate presence. Contact every single one of them, he instructed his assistant. Invite them to reapply. Tell them their applications will be personally reviewed by my office. He paused, thinking. And arrange a company-wide meeting for tomorrow morning. Word of Mrs. Wells's dramatic departure spread through the office like wildfire. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering about the security escort, the HR manager's pale face, the presence of legal team members on the floor. I heard she'd been discriminating against candidates, one whispered. Someone said the CEO himself caught her, another added. But how? He's always up in the executive floor. Mr. Thompson wheeled past one such group, noticing how they quickly fell silent. He could feel the tension, the uncertainty in the air. It was time to address this head-on. In the legal department, the team was already reviewing the recording. Their faces grew increasingly serious as they listened to Mrs. Wells's casual discrimination, her dismissal of company policies, her misuse of her position. This is grounds for immediate termination, the head of legal confirmed. And we'll need to review every hiring decision she's made since joining the company. Mr. Thompson nodded. I want a complete audit. Every rejection, every hire, every comment she's made about candidates. We need to understand the full scope of the damage. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from board members. The news had reached them at their retreat. Some were worried about public relations, others about potential lawsuits. But Mr. Thompson had bigger concerns. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow afternoon, he told his assistant. It's time we made our position absolutely clear. Late into the evening, the office was still buzzing with activity. The HR department was in chaos, with temporary staff brought in to help review 3 months' worth of applications. The legal team worked overtime, preparing statements and reviewing policies. Mr. Thompson sat in his office, looking out over the city lights. The events of the day played through his mind, every dismissive comment, every prejudiced assumption. But what haunted him most were the people he hadn't met, the talented candidates who had walked away thinking they weren't good enough. His assistant knocked gently on the door. Sir, the first responses are coming in from the rejected candidates. Many of them are, well, you should read these yourself. The emails on his screen told stories of crushed dreams, of self-doubt, of people who had questioned their own worth because of one person's prejudice. But they also showed something else: resilience, hope, and gratitude for this second chance. Send personal replies to each one, he said. Let them know that what happened to them was wrong, and that our company is better than that. As night fell over the city, Mr. Thompson worked on his speech for tomorrow's company meeting. This wasn't just about firing one prejudiced manager. It was about reinforcing the values the company was built on, about making sure nothing like this ever happened again. His wheelchair sat beside his desk, a reminder of why he'd started this company in the first place, to create a place where people would be judged by their abilities, not their disabilities. Tomorrow would be the first step in making sure that vision became reality. The company auditorium was packed the next morning. Employees filled every seat, their usual morning chatter replaced by an expectant hush. At exactly 9 a.m., Mr. Thompson wheeled onto the stage, approaching the microphone with the same quiet confidence he'd shown throughout his career. Yesterday, he began, his voice clear and strong, something happened in our company that made me question whether we've truly lived up to our values. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Most of you have heard by now about the incident in HR, but what you don't know is the full story. The room fell completely silent as he described his undercover investigation, the discriminatory interview, and the shocking revelations that followed. People exchanged glances, some nodding in recognition of behaviors they'd noticed but never reported. I built this company from my wheelchair, he continued, not despite it, but with it. Every challenge I faced taught me something valuable. Every person who doubted me pushed me to work harder. But the greatest lesson I learned was this: talent doesn't come in one shape, one size, or one form. As he spoke, his assistant began distributing new company policies to every department head. Starting today, we're implementing changes. Every hiring decision will be reviewed by a diverse panel. Every candidate will be judged solely on their abilities and potential. And most importantly, every employee will be trained to recognize and challenge their own biases. The press conference that afternoon made headlines across the business world. News channels picked up the story of the CEO who went undercover to expose discrimination in his own company. But Mr. Thompson wasn't interested in publicity. He was focused on making real changes. 1 week later, the company's lobby looked different. New faces filled the halls, including several employees who had previously been rejected. A developer in a wheelchair worked alongside her team, her technical skills finally given the recognition they deserved. A senior manager with a prosthetic leg led a client meeting, his expertise speaking louder than any physical difference. The story spread through the corporate world, prompting other companies to examine their own hiring practices. Messages poured in from people sharing similar experiences, thanking Mr. Thompson for taking a stand. 1 month after the incident, the company hosted its first Inclusive Innovation Fair. The event showcased projects from employees of all abilities, proving that diversity drove creativity and success. The same clients Mrs. Wells had worried about now praised the company's forward-thinking approach. In the HR department, a new team worked diligently, led by a director who had herself faced discrimination in her career. Their walls displayed a simple motto: talent has no limits. 6 months later, the company's success spoke for itself. Production rates were up, innovation had increased, and employee satisfaction reached new highs. The diverse perspectives brought by new hires led to breakthrough solutions that might never have been discovered otherwise. Mr. Thompson still sometimes visited the interview room where it all began. But now, instead of being a place of judgment and discrimination, it was where careers launched and dreams began. The questions asked there were about skills, ideas, and potential, never about limitations. 1 year after the incident, at the company's annual meeting, Mr. Thompson looked out at his employees. The audience before him represented every kind of ability, disability, background, and experience. Each person had been hired for their talents, their ideas, their potential to contribute. A year ago, he said in his closing speech, we faced a moment of truth about who we were and what we stood for. Today, I look at all of you and see what's possible when we judge people by their abilities, not their disabilities. When we look past our prejudices to see potential. When we remember that every person deserves a fair chance to prove themselves. As he finished speaking, the applause wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had ever been unfairly judged, every dream that had been dismissed, and every barrier that had been broken down. The company hadn't just changed its hiring practices, it had changed corporate culture itself. And somewhere in the city, a former HR manager watched the news of the company's success, finally understanding the true meaning of professional standards.